All right, and we are live right now. We're streaming across the internet. We'll be starting the program here in about 4 minutes. So thank you to everybody who is joining us from across the internet. We're on about 12 to 15 different platforms, and we're going to have an amazing conversation today. We're going to be talking about Paul Revere and his Midnight Ride, and we're going to be talking with Kostya Kennedy, who is the author of the new best-selling book about Paul Revere, and looking forward to finding out how he got into that and why he decided to write that book. But this is part of our America 250 series. You saw our episode earlier this week. We did an episode with David Barton about the founders, about Jefferson, about the Declaration of Independence, and a lot of the history that people may not know. And that's the Declaration side, which is officially when we become a nation. But this had been brewing for a while, and Paul Revere's ride actually happened about 14 months before the Declaration of Independence was actually pinned and signed. So, there are a lot of things going on. So we'll get that larger context and why it matters today, and why is he the folk legend that we look to now about the beginnings of the revolution. So what are the things that are true that we know, and what are the things that are a bit fable, and how did that come to be? So I'm looking forward to having that conversation, and I'll talk a little bit about this once the episode starts. But Kostya is a best-selling author. He's a journalist. He's an editor at People Inc., which has publications such as People Magazine and other publications. And he's the author of a number of books, as he said, very American books, but a lot of sports. Joe DiMaggio, Pete Rose, fascinating stories. I finished his book last night and really did enjoy it. It was action-packed. And I really recommend people do check it out. We're going to be having a couple of other episodes in the America 250 series. So we've talked about the founding documents, and then we're going to be moving into the revolution today. But then we're going to head west, and we're going to go into the frontier. And one of the early frontier characters, also a legend, but also real, is John Chapman, or Johnny Appleseed. And we're going to be talking about his movement from Massachusetts, where we're going to be talking about today, all the way to around Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is where he is believed to have passed away, and how he amassed wealth, even though he lived as a pauper during his time. So, this country has an amazing 250 years of history and beyond, and we're going to be celebrating that through these episodes and as best as we can, because what we do here is we pull back the curtain and look under the hood as to how politics, campaigns, the media, all of this actually works today. But we wouldn't have those things if it wasn't for the document that was signed 250 years ago tomorrow. We're recording this and doing the live stream on July 3rd. And, we wouldn't have these things. We wouldn't have the representation if it wasn't for, no taxation without representation. And those ideas, we wouldn't be able to do politics and campaigns and do things like that if it wasn't for that. So thank you everybody for being here. Since this is the live stream, you can post comments and questions at any point during the show. We will bring you into the conversation. We really do appreciate your feedback and your input to this. So do check out the book. It's available anywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you buy books, but do check out Kostya Kennedy's book, and we'll start right.
Welcome to Political Trade Secrets, an inside look at campaigns and politics, where we pull back the curtain, look under the hood, and investigate all aspects of politics and how elections are won. Now, here's your host, Dustin Olson.
Pollster and host of the Political Trade Secrets podcast, Dustin Olson.
Dustin Olson.
Dustin Olson.
And Dustin Olson, pollster at American Pulse. They work for both Republicans and Democrats. And he hosts a podcast, Political Trade Secrets. Oh, we love that. We like that podcast.
Now, from Washington, D.C., is pollster Dustin Olson.
And welcome to Political Trade Secrets. I'm your host, Dustin Olson. Thank you all very much for joining us today as we continue our America 250 series. We really do appreciate you choosing to spend some time, especially for those of you who are streaming in from across the internet for the live stream version of this. We want you to join the conversation today. We are going to be talking about The Ride, Paul Revere, and the Night That Saved America, and with the author Kostya Kennedy of that great book. I just finished it last night. Truly enjoyed it. Kostya is a best-selling author, journalist, and editor at People Inc., where they have publications such as People Magazine and others. And he's the author of a number of best-selling books, many of which are around sports. And I'm looking forward to checking out the one on Joe DiMaggio in particular, but also Pete Rose. All amazing characters. But we'll talk to him more about some of his other work during the conversation. But really, in our America 250 series, we are exploring the foundings of this country that actually have given us the ability to do what we do here, which is pull back the curtain on the way campaigns and politics and elections and the media work. But if it wasn't for what happened all those years ago, we would not be able to do the things that we do today. So we thank you for helping us celebrate. Do check out our program we had with David Barton earlier in the week, where we talked about the founding documents, the founders, Thomas Jefferson, and the Declaration of Independence. Today, we're going to be talking about the Revolution and Kostya Kennedy's book, The Ride, Paul Revere, and the Night That Saved America, which you can get anywhere you get books. And then we're going to be moving into the frontier. We're going to be talking about Johnny Appleseed and John Chapman in one of our upcoming episodes with Howard Means, the author of the book, Johnny Appleseed. So a lot of really great stuff, but we'd like to have your feedback during this conversation. So wherever you are, if you're watching this on YouTube, on X, wherever it is, please do post a comment or question. But another way that you can help out the program that really does help with the algorithms and promoting this to even more people, because people, they'll get a lot out of this conversation, knowing a little bit more about how the revolution started and the important role that Paul Revere and others played in that process. So if you want to help us out, like, follow, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you enjoy the podcast: YouTube, X, Facebook, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever it is. That really does help out, and we appreciate it. Or if you'd like to help us amplify the voice of the American people with our work here at American Pulse, which sponsors the Political Trade Secrets podcast, you can join our polling community. You can do so either as a free member or as a paid member. But what you can do as a member is you can suggest questions that we would ask people across this country in our next survey to get the American people's feelings on various issues. You can suggest topics, suggest specific questions, and then additionally, you'll get exclusive insights from those surveys so that you can have a better sense for what the American people think. So thank you all very much for being here today and for helping celebrate America's 250th anniversary. I'm going to be enjoying my coffee with my America 250 mug as we go through this conversation. So hoist your own glass, enjoy this conversation. So without further ado, my conversation with Kostya Kennedy. Kostya, thank you very much for being here.
Hey, Dustin, good to be with you.
Excellent. So I just finished your book last night. I truly enjoyed it. I thought it was action-packed. And I'm guessing that this was part of the reason why you picked that topic to write about, because it is a lot of action happening in the story. But truly, why you've written a lot about sports and other topics. Why did you decide to write about Paul Revere?
So I'll start kind of at the end of that, which is I really appreciate your description of the book and feeling there was a lot of action. I felt like it was a story. It's called The Ride, Paul Revere and the Night Saved America, and it's not meant to be necessarily cradle to grave Paul Revere. I certainly try to give context of his life especially before what would lead somebody to this point and after. But I felt like focusing primarily on that night and on the events surrounding that night leading up to it, I could do kind of a journalistic narrative and keep the pace flowing. So that appealed to me a lot more than, say, a straight biography, which is consistent with some of the other work I've done. In terms of Paul Revere proper, I mean, I was certainly aware that we were nearing this wonderful anniversary in our country, and that was a reason to get interested in it. This is, of course, some years ago when I first had the idea. But I think personally, I remember hearing the poem, as you, Dustin, probably heard, and many listeners out there, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride" of Paul Revere, and being read that poem. I was maybe 8 or 9. I was well old enough to read, but I loved it. Many of us do. I love being read too. And being read that poem in a book, a big volume of poems that had no pictures. And that kind of turned out to be important because it let me have my imagination at that point see the ride as I saw it, which may be a little different than anybody would see it. And then journalistically and professionally, part of it was the timing and what I just described, being focused on an event. But I was really intrigued by him meeting the moment of his life. That's something else that has sort of been part of like what I did with DiMaggio or Jackie Robinson or some others, and rising to that occasion, and if Revere and the others, and I talked about, there were other riders that night, certainly hardly that Revere did it alone, but he was a principal, crucial figure. If he hadn't executed as well as he did, say, call it 12, 15 hours from about 10 p.m. on April 18th, 1775, till the 19th, the morning of the 19th, as the battles of Lexington and Concord began, we would have had a vastly different path through the American Revolution. I'm not suggesting we would still be driving on the wrong side of the street and cheerio here in 2026. But I don't think July 4th, 1776 would have been our Independence Day if we hadn't been so successful at beating back the British early on, improbably, unexpectedly successful, and that carried over 2 months later to the Battle of Bunker Hill, which technically the British won by holding ground, but suffered great casualties. If the ride and all that's around it hadn't gone as well, it would have been a very different trajectory. So all of those things kind of appealed to me in tackling the subject.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I forgot Jackie Robinson. I mean, that's one of the greats, and it must have been fascinating to write that book. So that's the first thing is I think people may not realize, because we're celebrating July 4th, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But this happened, as you pointed out, you said around 10 p.m. on April 18th, 1775.
Right.
So the anniversary of this happened about 14 months ago, and into the morning of the 19th, at which point his night kind of ends when he's captured. Is that right?
Well, he is briefly captured, but he gets out. He loses his horse to the British, but he gets out and goes back into Lexington on foot. So Revere is actually on Lexington Green when the first shot is fired the next morning. He stayed involved as time went on, but his ride ended early that morning. His ride continued figuratively by foot.
By foot, yeah.
And he was and actually why we initially, the very first details about his ride came out just a couple of days later when he was deposed and asked, along with many other people, what happened, because they wanted to know who fired the first shot. Then as today, neither side really wanted the responsibility for having set this great war in motion. So that's how he initially gave his very first report on the ride, which is a couple of days after the 19th of 75.
That's fascinating. So we're 14 months beforehand, and people would say that this is truly the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Of course, there had been a lot of stuff leading up to this point. And tomorrow we're going to be celebrating the 4th, but that's really, as I understood it, the reason why that is the day is that's when we declared our independence, which allowed France to come in and help us, because otherwise they would be supporting, I guess, a civil war. They needed to be able to support an actual nation. So that's why that happened. But the war had been going on for quite some time at this point, starting with those shots fired in Lexington. So I guess to kind of paint the picture of, we have a sense of the timing of all of this, who are the important characters? Because it wasn't just Paul Revere. There were other people who were involved and other things going on that culminated in this ride and others.
Yeah, so I mean, just really briefly to just set the stage of how we got to 75. If you go back to the French and Indian War, which ended in the 1760s, British and well, everybody was British, but forces from London and Great Britain fought alongside forces from the colonies here. So George Washington and Thomas Gage, who would later be the head of the British military in America during the time of the Revolution, fought side by side in the French and Indian War. So it was very close, just not that long ago, maybe 15 years before the ideas of the revolution even began, that mainland, the mothership, the crown, in England and Great Britain, and this fledgling nation here, not yet a nation in America, were very much side by side. And so you had people, all they ever really knew was to be under the operation of the crown. And after that war, things weren't so great in London in terms of economics, and that's when the British wanted to put in a tax.
Yeah.
And do a few other things. It wasn't just the taxes, but that was a critical part. And tensions began to get more and more severe, particularly in the Boston area. That's really where this all started. And there's lots of people, and historians can cite any number of people, but to me, there's really four: John Hancock, John Adams, Samuel Adams, and Joseph Warren were really the four guys at the head of forming this revolution, beginning some acts of resistance. One of the famous ones, of course, is the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Paul Revere was part of that. He was on the ships and helped, so with Joseph Warren, throw the tea overboard. And Revere was already then an express rider. We could talk about that a little later. And it was he who took the news of the Boston Tea Party by horse down to Hartford, New York, Philadelphia. That's the only way they would find out quickly enough what had happened. This was beginning, the whole idea then, and as I mentioned, there was taxes that the colonists didn't like. There were also British forces in Boston and the Boston area beginning about 1768, and at its peak there were about 16,000 people living in Boston, Greater Boston, and 4,000 redcoat soldiers. So that's 1 out of 5. That's kind of an occupied territory. They were appointing people in the judicial system that were loyal to the crown instead of letting them be chosen here, and things like that that were breeding discontent. And the last point on this is that I want to go back to your point, which is a really good one, that the Declaration of Independence is 1776. At the time of Revere's ride, there was some thought of independence, but not really. The idea was, we don't like the way you're handling us. It wasn't, so get your act in, get yourself in better shape and treat us with more respect. We don't want these taxes, et cetera, some other things enumerated. But they were still pledging allegiance, so to speak, to King George. And it was only later, Thomas Paine really being at the forefront of it, and others, of course, that the notion of true independence, of actually breaking free, came to be. And again, that happened partly through the success of the early part of the revolution, the success at Lexington and Concord, the success along the way that made people here believe maybe we could actually do it. It was an intimidating, scary thing to think about leaving the rule and the protection of England.
Yeah, it's from this perspective, 250 years later, or in this case, 251 years later, we have the benefit of knowing how it turned out. They had no idea how this could go, and which is why they pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. They knew that they were possibly signing their death warrant when they.
And that's right. And when you think about it, even at the notion, Paul Revere is riding around. He stops by your house, right, and he's like, Dustin, we're going to fight the British, right? You've got maybe a fowling piece or some hunting gun. You've got your crops you're trying to maintain for your life. And we're going to get a bunch of us, and we're going to go take on the best trained, best equipped, most experienced army in the world. There were a lot of people like, Paul, I'm good. I'm going to hang out. We've got a cribbage game going. But enough people, of course, did come out and risk their lives and turn this idea into reality, that you could actually take on such a formidable force.
Well, let's talk about Joseph Warren. And you mentioned Paul Revere being an express writer. This is the thing that he really contributed to the war effort. And I guess, if correct me if I'm wrong, this is there's various committees on correspondence, right, or committees of correspondence,
Yep.
which in a way is an intelligence network. Is that right?
Yep. It's a way largely intelligence, also just sort of maybe not classified as secret information, but any information getting out. But yes, a lot of it was intelligence. So I guess in terms of the system, how it worked, and it was really Samuel Adams who kind of divides it. Warren helped lead it, and Revere had a really important part in it. So in the 1750s, say, if you lived in Boston and you wanted to get a letter down to somebody in New York, you wrote a letter and you gave it to a guy who rode down in a sulky, a horse and carriage, and got there maybe a week or two later and got a reply and came back a week or so later. And that's how much communication happened. Around the late 1760s, Samuel Adams put into effect this system of express riders. And these were, like I say, these were the people when it absolutely positively had to get there overnight. And they were numerous guys, but Revere was the best they had.
Yeah.
He was the single best express rider, as demonstrated by why he was. So it was no accident that he was chosen for this ride on the April 18th of 75. He was not only a very good rider, he must have been very good on the back of a horse. He was also very trustworthy, and not trustworthy just in the sense of that he wouldn't betray anybody, but that he was intelligent and capable enough to remember what he needed to tell people, because usually you couldn't bring documents with you. It would be treasonous if you were caught carrying some stuff. And you're giving people information on Red Coat activity, as you mentioned, some intelligence about British plans. And he was good at really, John Adams said in a letter, Paul Revere will give you all the news. He was really good at showing up and saying, this is what's happening, this is what you need to do, and then moving on. And be capable enough to answer a couple questions if you have them, but not hang around and dilly-dally, go to the next place, do it. And all those put together, it's not true that everybody could do it, right? Like not everybody was. So that was his prince, as you mentioned. He did other things. He worked as part of a local spy network and did some other organizing for sure. But that riding was clearly his most significant contribution to the start of the revolution.
Well, as you're saying, that is your role as an editor. He was a good editor. He knew what information to lay out and leave everything else on the
Yep. And he was unfailingly, as many of them were, but he was just absolutely faithful to the cause. One of the things about him, though, he wasn't particularly good, it's interesting, at sort of holding information, meaning that he had this one ride up to Portsmouth in particular that I'm remembering. This was in late 74 winter. It was about a 60-mile ride, and the road was not good. It was frozen, hard road. And they had knowledge that the British, they thought, were going to take over a fort there to try to get hold of all the weaponry there, the gunpowder and the cannon. And when he got out in Portsmouth, somebody said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, well, we think the British are coming out." He just said flat out what was going on. And it turned out that person was somebody loyal to the crown who went and told the loyalist governor. Revere would just sort of say it. And when he was captured on the night of his famous ride, and they said, "What's going on?" he just told them what's going on. He knew more about what was happening that night than the small suite of British riders who brought him in. And so he was just very bluff and direct and confident, and that was his mode of operating.
That's fascinating. I'm going to remind people, if you want to post questions or comments and join the conversation, please do so wherever you're watching across the internet right now as we're live. If you're watching later on, when it's the recorded version, feel free to make a comment. We'll do our best to respond to those here at Political Trade Secrets. But so he wasn't the only person who went out on that night. Who are some of the other people who were critical to this information getting out there?
So there were two riders who left from Boston itself, one of whom, and I have a chapter on him in my book, William Dawes, who went out over the south end of Boston. There's basically only one way out by land at that point. There were no bridges going off the main area of Boston. and he went through what was called Boston Neck. And Revere, who went out, he had to initially start on a rowboat, and that could have gone very wrong, but stole out on a rowboat across the Charles River and began his ride in Charlestown, for those who know the Boston area. So those were the only two who went out that night. Dawes, for some reason, he went out, we think, a little earlier. He set off from Warren's house earlier than Revere did. Revere had to stop, among other things, and let them know how many lanterns to hang in the church, one if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore shall be. I'm going back to the poem, but that's part of the story. But Dawes took a long time. By the time they were headed to Lexington, and they were headed to Lexington specifically because that's where Hancock and Adams were staying. They had moved out of Boston because things got just too hot in Boston. Vandals were damaging Hancock's house. They could have been arrested, either one of them, any time. So they've been for a few weeks out in Lexington. And Revere and Warren and the rest kind of knew and ended up being pretty accurate in what the British were after, but didn't know exactly. And they thought maybe they're going to Lexington first, and they did pass there to try to get these guys, and then they were going to get military stores in Concord. So they both set off, Dawes and Revere, to Lexington, but Revere, as I mentioned, gets to Lexington first, and by the time Dawes gets there, it later becomes clear that he hadn't really been successful in warning people, and we're not really sure why that is, but we know anecdotally, like many people said that they heard from Revere, they were warned by Revere, warned by somebody who Revere warned, and nobody gave that anecdotal information about Dawes. And also there's a roll call of who was at Lexington and Concord, and there just weren't people from the areas where Dawes went through, where they did come from the areas where Revere touched. Now, Revere, who went out, as I mentioned, across the river and then through sort of the northwest suburbs of Boston, he would tell somebody, as I described, here's what's going on. And some people would go get their horse and start heading towards Lexington. Other people got on a horse, or a couple times he met a doctor out on his rounds, and they would ride further out into further suburbs and tell those people. And they would tell other people. And they had a little system out there where sometimes 3 shots would be fired in one town, and that would be heard at another town, and that was a signal that something was happening. And at one point, there were maybe 30 or more riders. You can imagine looking from above and seeing like this neural network of riders going through the meadows and the roads of Boston, of outer Boston, of the suburbs, spreading the word. And so that's what it took. And when you think about the number of people, by the time the British were coming back from Concord, there were several thousand Patriot soldiers, or just people, militiamen, along the banks of the road where the British were. And there's no way that one guy, no matter how good he was, could get that across. So Revere was the progenitor, and the lantern tipped a few people off, but there was a whole network of people banding together to get this done.
That's fascinating. So he was able to catalyze people as he's going along, and it had a huge impact. It's interesting. You talk about it in the book about the Dawes family and others later on being a little bit out of sorts because he doesn't get the recognition that Paul Revere had. But it's very clear, like from a military perspective, he definitely had an impact. Something I was fascinated by is that he used rented or borrowed horses. He's this famous rider, yet it wasn't until later he bought his own, I think, midlife mare or something like that. Like, why was that?
He had a mare for a little bit, but if you lived in Boston, it's like living in the heart of New York or Chicago or someplace where you don't need a car, right? Like, what were you going to really do with the horse? He lived in the north end of Boston. He had a silversmith shop down at the harbor. He could walk to it. Everything you did, you walked. There were a few sort of like sulkies and horse and buggies around, but you weren't really riding a horse around that much in the city. And the other thing, Dustin, these were long rides that were hard on horses. So he had several rides going to New York or Philadelphia where he's changing out horses along the way, right? 350 miles to Philadelphia. So he maybe 80 miles, 100 miles on a horse, changing out to a different one. Yeah, so it was always it was a borrowed horse that night, and it was always the rented or borrowed horse. He would typically in his rides maybe did a dozen and a half, 18 rides or more. So before this night, he would put in a bill, which essentially John Hancock would pay. Hancock was very wealthy, and say, this is what it costs to rent the horses, this is what it costs me to stay overnight. He did go pro bono on the night of the ride itself. Didn't charge for that one. And that's how it worked. It just and that's another thing that says, if you're good, if you're able to ride a horse, you can ride a horse. But every horse is a little different and has their own temperament. So that's another skill you have to get used to. It's not just it's not just running. It's interesting. Also, I'll say one last thing about the horses. They weren't necessarily the fastest, most powerful horses. They were about 14 hands. That's the horse height, which is about the size of a pony today. Mm-hmm. And they were pacers. They were really good on uneven terrain, and they had a lot of good stamina. And that was even more important than speed necessarily, right? Because like even on a night of the ride, Revere and Dawes, anyone else, they're going by themselves. The British are moving between 800 and 1,000 soldiers, bringing cannon, gun. They have to cross the river. It's just going to take them longer, right? Yeah. So you need to get there faster. You need to get there speedy, but you're going to be able to do that even if you're not on Secretariat.
And you have to get there, and you have to get there a far distance. So
yeah,
there's somebody a horse that can keep the pace, and that is reliable made a difference. That makes a lot of sense. So tell us a little bit more about Paul Revere, the man. So he makes a little bit of money off of these rides, but that's not mainly where he made his money. He does okay for himself, but tell us a little bit about his professional life.
So he was a silversmith. His father had immigrated here from France, come here when the father, Paul Revere Sr., name was Apollos Rivoire, a Frenchman, was about 13 or 15. And then Revere was born kind of into that trade. His father was a silversmith. Revere's father died when Revere was about 20, so he had to finish self-learning. You weren't allowed to go into business until you were 21. You had to do sort of a last year of work, and that was his primary business. He joined the Masons, which is a very important social group with a couple of different chapters in Boston then, partly the way to generate awareness for his work and his business and get known. He had a prominent spot on the wharf. He did other things. He was an engraver. There's an engraved depiction of the Boston Massacre, which is an event that occurred in 1770, which Revere did. He didn't paint it, but he engraved it, and that's probably the second most famous thing about him. He was a dentist for a while, a self-trained dentist, so patient beware.
Yeah.
But that's what he did, and primarily silversmith, and that business took a little bit of a back seat as he became more and more politically active, and it did cost him to do that. He had a lot of children, and he had a very successful business. Again, it wasn't well. Another important thing just to note, which was sort of like the American promise in those years, even before it was articulated, but imagine somebody like Hancock, the Adamses, Warren. These were all that said Hancock especially, but they were men of wealth. They went to Boston Latin or Roxbury Latin. They all went to Harvard. Warren was a doctor. The Adamses were great orators, and they had all been in the country. Their families went back into the mid 1600s. Revere was, as I mentioned, his father just coming about 1715, born into a trade. He went to a trade school called the Writing School. He certainly wasn't going to go to college, and he elevated himself to be really those four guys, and again, I'm reducing it to four for the ease of us, but the power structures really respected him, trusted him, brought him in, even though he wasn't of their sort of correct, educational background and all of that. So that was an impressive thing to see. He did it partly by his just commitment to the cause, his reliability, his discipline, and that carried over, as you were saying about his professional life, into his professional work. He went on to become a bell maker later in his life. There are still about 150 Paul Revere bells in this country, which still many of them ring on a Sunday. And also he became a copper roller, a business he didn't start until he was in his 60s, and it became the primary provider of rolled copper in the War of 1812. And the main use of that is to cover the sheath of the hulls of the boats to protect it from damage. And really, really important. There's some people who say, hey, that was the biggest impact he had on American military. It's certainly not as sexy or as easy to grasp as the ride. So he stayed very active in his business life. And there's also Paul Revere Silver, which people to this day still have. It was a company, and it stayed alive in his family's and descendants' hands for many, many years.
Yeah, I remember lots of silver spoons that people must have been born with. That's fascinating. And on the bells, are there churches or places that you'd recommend people go and they could actually hear?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably easiest to look it up where you are. Most of them are in New England, but not entirely. There's one in Fredericksburg, Virginia, I know. At the Old North Church, which is where the lanterns were hung, mm-hmm. and where Revere, in sort of an event or occurrence that foreshadowed what would happen, he worked at Old North Church as a bell ringer at age 15, ringing this sort of series of 8 bells in a sequence, he and 7 others. And those bells have been here since 1744. They're called change bells because they all have a slightly different tone, and they're meant to be rung in succession like that. And they still ring certainly every Sunday and more often too in terms of events. I know there's one in the church in Falmouth on the Cape, New Hampshire, Vermont, all throughout that area. And you can find them if you look up. They're not all active, but many are. And yeah.
So he was a bell ringer. So he's up there, and you actually have the depiction of you going up there. So he would go up there, he'd make that climb, and are those. So most church bells these days are automated. Somehow they're, but back then they actually had a group of people who would go up and they would
yeah, play. And it was, I mentioned change bell ringing because this wasn't even then, this wasn't the most common. A lot of places just had a single bell or maybe 2 bells that would ring it to announce the service was beginning or the time or a funeral or a wedding or whatever it would be. Change bell ringing, it's sort of not a deeply difficult skill, but it's definitely a skill that has to be learned where in this case 8, it's usually between 6 and 12 people are ringing the bells according to like a certain pre-decided sequence. Sometimes it can just be called out by the lead ringer, and it's not always the same, but it creates a kind of music, and it's lovely to hear it. It's sort of symphonic, and that came over from Scotland initially and England. So those bells came, and these were the first of those type of bells that landed here in 1744. So yeah, it was a skill they had to get right, and you or I couldn't just walk in and like fill in for the guy on a day's notice. We'd need to be sort of indoctrinated a little bit in how it worked. And it was a big part of life. The Old North Church also, which is, people can go into it today, is an interesting church in that it had people right up to 75, people who were loyal to the crown, people who were patriots. They went to church together. They would also sometimes go to taverns together, go to social gatherings together. There wasn't, that's an important thing to remember, there wasn't really this deep sort of, people wanted kind of different things, but there wasn't this deep enmity. It wasn't as if, you hated every patriot. You couldn't, because your brother or your sister or your wife's brother might be on that side. And even as late as 74, they would do military training activities together, patriots and loyalists. So it was came from a place of closeness, that divide.
That makes sense. One of the things I enjoyed about the book is that you kind of bring to life some of these places. You also bring to life the ship. But you mentioned taverns. A lot of this seems to happen in one tavern there in the North End, correct?
There's a place called the Green Dragon Tavern, and that's no longer there. It was just sort of a basic tavern, and it was used for the Masonic meetings, for the Mason Lodge meetings, in the years when Revere was there. So that's sort of where the Boston Tea Party was planned, and you can tell because the rolls. Nobody signed in that night for the Masonic meeting because they were all down on the ships in Boston Harbor. But that's what a lot, and they had different. They'd have this caucus and that caucus that people belonged to different planning groups. Revere belonged to many of them. Not a lot of people did, but he did in the North End and also in the South End Meeting House. But at that tavern, and when I say tavern, it's not kind of exactly what you'd think today, where you just go in for a beer. You'd go in and there'd be coffee. Yes, there'd be ale, but often there were rooms. Taverns along the route were places where you might rent a horse, like the Buckman Tavern in Lexington is where people would keep their horses. And so at that particular Green Dragon Tavern, which is right by the water there, it was kind of more of a working class place, and his chapter of the Masons was more of a working class patriot group. But that's where he met Warren. Warren, as I said, he was a doctor. He was a very intelligent. He graduated like Harvard Medical School at age 21. Mm-hmm. He was a magnanimous. Another thing that like he was a doctor who believed firmly and wrote about in the papers that the need to break from British grip. But as a doctor, he would treat you whether you were a loyalist, whether you're a patriot, whether you're a black person, a white person, men, women, any age. Very principled doctor, which helped in many ways because he had a lot of respect. On the back end, then the British sort of hated him because they thought he was so treasonous to turn their back on him. But meeting Warren at this tavern was a critical thing in Revere's life. It really helped shape his thinking on sort of a deeper level, on a more involved level. And after Warren was killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill, it was Revere who was brought down to identify the body, and then he had a son. The next son that Revere had, he named Joseph Warren Revere. And the Revere who I spent time with is Paul Revere III. There are descendants out there. And he's actually the fifth great-great-great-grandson, but they weren't all called Paul. But he's a descendant from that line, the Joseph Warren Revere line.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating. The part where you kind of bring it to modern day, which is actually how I got interested in the story. I did a campaign outside of Boston almost 20 years ago, where Lexington and Concord are both in the district, and we did a midnight ride campaign tour where we campaigned through the night, and we ended in Lexington, and it was a lot of fun. But bringing that history forward, and even though it wasn't in Massachusetts, later campaigns we continued the midnight ride because it got national press and we had so much fun. But that's when I first really got interested in it. It
was a great idea. That's a wonderful idea, and it is an idea. I think that I don't know who your candidate was, but the idea of Paul Revere does seem to bridge political parties, and when people can understand it and grab it, even with different views of what it might mean. And it's a wonderful actual event, and it's a wonderful symbolic event. You mentioned it at one point, I think in the beginning, this sort of folk hero aspect, and that's definitely true. There's no question about it. Thanks to the poem, really, that we all know Paul Revere in that sort of aspect. But one of the things you realize, and I'm sure you had this working on your campaign or other things, but I certainly realized that as I'm digging into the nitty-gritty of his day-to-day life, this isn't Paul Bunyan, or this is an actual person, and this actually happened, and maybe he had a cold that day, or his foot hurt, or whatever, right? And as you also alluded to, we sometimes think that, history had to happen the way it happened, but it certainly didn't. Things could have gone very wrong. He wasn't a figure in some author's imagination. He was a living, breathing figure along with those around him, taking great risk, and not everything went perfectly, but enough went right.
Yeah, which is amazing. And coming back to the present again with Paul Revere III, I guess it would have been Paul Revere Jr., his dad. He told you the story about his dad, which reminded me of the campaign, because we, campaigned in Lexington. But tell that story, because that's just fun. That's just
it seemed almost improbable, but so it's on the April 18th in late 60s, and Paul Revere Jr., who is the father of, as you just set up, the person who I spoke to, but again, it's not still quite many generations removed from Paul Revere, gets pulled over for speeding. I think it was Route 28, one of those routes in Boston. And this is the days, there's certainly no internet, there's no computer, there's no, I don't even know if he had a walkie-talkie back to the station house. But he takes the license and the registration, he goes back, and Paul Revere Jr. can see the cop in his car for like a long time, just kind of staying there, and finally gets out, and he gives it back, and he says, "Listen, just go home. There is no way I can go back to the station and say I gave Paul Revere a ticket for speeding in Lexington."
On April 18th.
Yeah, and on April 18th, and the guy I spoke to, his son, said, I always thought that was, and he's a lawyer, Paul Revere III, who I spoke to, said, I always thought, yeah, Dad, right, that didn't happen. But then he said, I was on a case, and 30 years later in the 90s or something, and the other lawyer came over to me and said, would your dad get pulled over in Lexington? Because I had a state trooper who told me this story. So that's when it kind of became verified that it was a fact.
That's amazing. History rhymes sometimes. We have a comment from Dig Hawaii on YouTube. Good stuff. So thank you for the comment. And if anybody wants to post any comments or questions, feel free to do so. We do appreciate it. So one of the things that I probably didn't realize 20 years ago when I did that campaign is that it was more than just the British are coming that was going on at the time, and why this was important. And as I understand, John Hancock and Sam Adams were in real danger. And that's part of what was the catalyst for the Midnight Ride.
Yes, they were in danger. As I mentioned, they were out in Lexington because they were being in Boston was just too dangerous then, and pretty much anybody who was high up in the ranks or was seen as potentially a target for the British moved out of Boston. Joseph Warren being the one prominent exception, and Revere. They stayed in the north end of Boston, and Warren's house became kind of again, because he was a doctor, so people were naturally going in and out, but it became a place to trade information, some bit secret, some bit less secret. But in the case that you're mentioning about Sam Adams and John Hancock, they moved out to Lexington. They were staying in a reverend's house.
Was that Clark, Reverend Clark?
Reverend Clark, yeah, Jonas Clark. And their house was guarded, and they'd moved to provincial Congress out there. And it was really for their safety. And that night, one of the principal things they did was Revere went to their house first, after stopping at houses all along the way. But when he got to Lexington, he went there and he had told them to leave. And John Hancock didn't want to. John Hancock was sort of polishing his gun and wanted to go out and meet the British when they came, which they had to convince him you're much more valuable to the movement alive than dead, even if you were to successfully take out a couple of British soldiers, right? So they convinced him of that, thank goodness, and he didn't. He and Adams ended up getting away that night. But no, they were absolutely in danger. I will say that, the head of the British Army, who I alluded to briefly before, Thomas Gage, had kind of dual allegiances. He'd married a woman who was born in New Jersey, longstanding American family. And one of the reasons why he was so successful as a governor initially was he was really good at balancing allegiances and sort of keeping the peace between loyalists and patriots. So when the order came to close Boston Harbor, he closed Boston Harbor, but he tried not to antagonize as little as he could. Because he could have very easily, certainly they had the wherewithal, had Hancock and Adams arrested. Now, that would have risen the temperature a great deal, so that it wasn't just benevolence that he didn't do it, but also he was cautious not to sort of overstep. And in fact, when he would always say, when he sent a team out on expeditions, And before the night of the ride, before this march, there were smaller moves by the British soldiers to try to get hold of weaponry. He'd say, just do what you have to do. I don't want you going into any private homes. I don't want you violating anything. Treat people with respect. All of that stuff, which, as we all know, for any army in the world, some people follow that protocol and some people don't. So it wasn't 100% successful. But he was, sometimes the British would get annoyed that feeling he was too soft, and they called him Granny Gage. And maybe he could have been more decisive on that side, but he was certainly a human who felt the largeness of it and felt, look, a lot of people were killed, and it's not something I think anybody goes into easily thinking about, right? And in addition to the great victory, the lives lost on both sides created great pain and difficulty for families for generations after that. So he's a very interesting sort of principal figure on the other side, and plays into the danger that Hancock and Adams were in, and why they were at least able to get out to Lexington for a few weeks and get to some kind of safety.
And was there a warrant for their arrest or something to hang them on the spot or something like that?
It was to bring in, King George had said, I mean, it wasn't as official as a warrant, but there was a decree that came from King George saying that you had to bring them in. It was sort of a bounty, I guess I would say. It wasn't clear to necessarily kill them because you wanted to get information from them, right? So, and actually, one of the things that happened, so I mentioned Hancock's wealth, and he traveled with an entourage. And when he was in Lexington, he had with him family members and also a valet, a sort of right-hand man, who stayed not at the house, but at Buckman Tavern, maybe not even a quarter mile away or something. And that valet was the caretaker of Hancock's trunk. And in that trunk were all kinds of papers that talked about who was a spy for us, who we thought was a spy for them, this strategy, that strategy. Incredibly important documents that they knew could not fall in the hands of the British on the night of the British march, because it would give them all this information, of course, and would be completely treasonous. Then Hancock could certainly have been hung, would certainly have been brought back to England and tried.
Yeah.
And he left them when Revere succeeded in getting them away from Lexington, and they were going up to a town called Woburn, just a little 15 miles out or something. They suddenly realized they'd forgotten the trunk.
Wow.
And I often say it's a little like in Home Alone when Catherine O'Hara realized that she left Kevin. Like Kevin. And Revere went back with this valet to get the trunk out of Buckman Tavern. And he was carrying that trunk away, and that's why he was on the green at the moment the first shot was fired on the 19th.
That's fascinating. Going back to Gage, so it makes sense that he was a little more even-keeled since his wife was an American or colonist, and I get the sense that you explored it, but that I'd be curious to find out if you think she was the person who gave them the heads up.
Yeah, so Dustin, when you do these books, you have to make decisions about what you really feel and so if I really knew something, I just wrote it. And here I just I do want to leave it to the reader. I present all the information I have, and I want the reader to sort of make their best judgment, because I this woman is dead 200 years, so I shouldn't worry about staining her reputation. But I don't want to say, either way. So, but the principles what you're leading out to is that she, beloved by her husband, she was 15 years younger, very beautiful woman, a little bit flamboyant. She had a wonderful portrait made of her. And early on, she said to him, I hope you won't do anything that will hurt my countrymen. And by that, she meant her American. And Gage, who was absolutely loyal to the crown and had grown up there, had also bought a lot of land in New York, imagined settling there afterward, heard that. And Margaret Kemble Gage, who's his wife, at one point said the figure in the tragedy of Tragedy of King John by Shakespeare, the figure named Blanche, and it was much more in currency than the people who would read Shakespeare, and she is torn between two sides of the Scottish War and the British War, and says she feels she's doubly yoked, and if my uncle wins, I lose, and if my father wins, I lose, and all that. And Margaret Kemble Gage had said to a friend of hers that she felt like that character Blanche, doubly yoked. And so what we later learned is that a few days before the actual ride, Samuel Adams out of Lexington had received some information about when the British were going to go. And at this point, it was incredibly, incredibly closely held information. Everybody felt something was going to happen, right? It was like a simmering pot, but it could happen at any moment, right? You don't know when it's going to happen or not. And Gage's plan, even on the night of it, the afternoon of it, almost nobody knew what they were going to do. Just a really, really tightly close held two people for a while. But somebody 2 days before gave some information to Samuel Adams. And later it was said that he received this information from a woman who was, quote, doubly yoked in politics.
Yeah.
And so, first of all, there aren't that many people that have access to Samuel Adams. Not any woman of this, in a regular profession or something would have access. And then that description of doubly yoked. And then this sort of circumstantial stuff and what happened. She was later sent back. In August, she was sent back to England while Thomas Gage stayed here. But that suspicion dogged her throughout her life. And then there's other people who say, the leak may have come elsewhere. So, but it is a pretty interesting thought. Not that she was necessarily a full-on spy, but she may have believed at that moment, look, if I can somehow prevent all these people being killed, to prevent this war escalating, I'm going to do it. I'm going to say it. So you can certainly see that it could have been her who spilled that information.
Well, you make it. I think this is something that you mentioned, is that because of her status and having money, she could have gotten somebody else, because she wasn't going to just be walking around in the cloak and dagger doing that stuff. But she would have had access to people to go and take the information or something like that. Yeah,
it was almost certainly a messenger who brought it. Right? She wouldn't have. I mean, it definitely was. There was no way that the wife of Thomas Gage was walking into the house where
the Green Dragon or something.
Yeah, at that time. At that point, it was way too much friction.
But I think it's a fascinating story, and from what I understood is that there's only a couple of people who actually would have known the information. Not that they ever say that she was one of those people, but he mentions that there's only a couple of people who know this information. Right?
I mean, that's the other thing. He said there was that, and the name just escaped me right now, but he told his general what the plans were, and he told his general, I've told only one other person.
Yeah.
And this was a couple of days before. By the day of, a few more people knew and things started to come out. But even as these soldiers set off after nightfall on the 18th, many of them didn't really know where they were going. They might have had an idea, right, where are we going, but it was meant to be kept as tight as possible because, again, like anybody could be anybody in those days. Most people weren't wearing the red uniform. You didn't know where their allegiance were. Yeah.
This is one of those things that you're mentioning. There's so many things that could have gone a different way if she was the person, had she just not decided to do anything, or if she had been out of town or whatever it was, could have been a completely different situation.
Absolutely. There's so many things that had to fall right. And that's certainly one of them. And she's a very intriguing figure. And, and again, it's this sort of, when you're working on a book like this and there's all these discoveries, and her name had certainly been out there, not like I first found her name, but I did find some things and some discussion of her that was new to me and I think new to the public in what she may have done. And it was kind of exciting to find that, and kind of exciting, you read actual correspondence and things that people wrote, and again, it just hits home like this happened, and there was these vulnerabilities and these successes. So she was definitely a person who really materialized as a more three-dimensional character, and was fascinating to get to know a little bit in doing this.
Absolutely. So, kind of bringing this back into the moment right now, 250 years after the Declaration was signed or started to be signed. I guess it took a few weeks before it was fully signed. Uh, why does this matter to us now? This whole story, Paul Revere, these events. Why does this specifically matter to us in this context?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways and a lot of things you can take from Paul Revere. So when the poem Paul Revere was written by the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, I just go back there because it's sort of in continuum with now. That was in 1860. It was first published in 1861 in the Atlantic Monthly by Longfellow. And it was written as sort of a call to action for abolitionists to stand up against the notion of slavery. And he was using this figure, this sort of lone rider, as sort of a inspiration. Again, both symbolic and actual, of somebody who can meet the moment of their lives, take some risk because they believe in a cause and affect change. And I think that's a resonant message today too, right? And to actually do some action. It's also important to note this was a nonviolent action. Of course, it led to the war, but he didn't take his pistols that night. He wasn't going out to create violence. He was going out to give information, and he believed very strongly in his cause. So I think, in a broad sense, that's a big thing to look for. And I alluded to this before, but one thing that's really struck me, and I was privileged to do a talk on this at the Library of Congress, and they have these dinners where there's 200 people there, and they're members of Congress, and at every table, including mine, there's Democrats and Republicans, and they're sitting together and they're talking, and I have no idea what most of them are talking about, but it feels like they're talking about, like, on this night, my book and Paul Revere and things like that. They're not necessarily talking about their differences in the weeds of politics on that day, how it feels. But I'm struck at how a figure like this can be sort of, it's a reminder that we are all kind of from the same place and we're all after the same thing on some basic level. And if we can see past some of the noise, there's always going to be differences. And I feel like that was I saw it that night, and I've seen it even, there's a Tea Party group in Michigan that calls its citizen outreach program Operation Paul Revere. And then you get Greta Thunberg holding up 2 lanterns to warn against climate change. And many other examples I could give you of people on both sides of the aisle, different social opinions and all that, commenting on what he truly was. It was a heroic act along with other people, of course, that night. And that's something to remember. And I think that we can rally around. It can be a point of agreement for people.
Yeah. Well, thinking about it for this audience, we have young people who are getting into politics on both sides of the aisle. We have Democrats and Republicans here. So part of what I do here is try to bring people together. But then you have people who are thinking about running for office, and possibly Paul Revere is an example for anybody who has thought about it, has thought about serving, but then maybe is thinking maybe they don't want to go out there and do that. But he's somebody who he met the moment, as you said, when it was needed, and when it was time to act, he took the action. So some people can draw some courage from what he did, and we all get to benefit from it.
And it's a wonderful thing to say. And I think also, thinking about your audience and people who are going to run, he was not a politician. He himself never sought to run. And no, I guess it's an obvious thing, but if you're going into office or you're in office, you need other people. You need other people to do some of the work and to believe in the cause, and again, I go back to, like, Paul Revere will give you all the news, to do it in a way that's honest to your own campaign or beliefs, and that's what Revere was really, really good at.
That's awesome. There's some things to definitely learn there. Well, Kostya, if you could tell us a little bit more about your other books and where people can get your books, and tell us a little bit about that and what you're working on.
Great, thank you. So my previous books were sports related, but they were also, and my wife mentioned this to me sort of after the fact. I hadn't realized they're very American books. So Joe DiMaggio which was my first book. It's called 56, and it's about his hitting streak in the summer of 41. But that year it's called The Last Innocent Summer. It's right before Pearl Harbor, but people were being drafted. It was sort of war was imminent, and he's an Italian-American hero, not named Al Capone. And that was a complicated thing to be at that time in this country, especially as about to go to war with, among others, Italy. And so the book tried to do that, and he again met his moment in this incredibly pressurized streak. Pete Rose had this sort of moral dilemma about him, right? Like, there's no way to cleanly say. In some ways, you can admire him as much as anybody for the effort that he put into the game. And on the other side, I'm just boiling it down for a quick soundbite here, but the other side, his gambling wasn't me saying, Dustin, I'll put $10 on the Reds. It was a lot of money to the wrong people in organized gambling. It was no joke. It wasn't like, hey, so it's a real dilemma. Jackie Robinson, of course, I tried to focus on 4 distinct seasons in his life, actual seasons, also metaphorically, the spring, summer, fall, and winter of his life. And I did a book on high school football, which is kind of getting into would you let your child play football in this age of concussion, and all the value that football brings to people's lives. And again, the mixing of people of different socioeconomic class on a football field, the mixing of different backgrounds, and the shared effort and what that can mean. So those were my books, and kind of I mentioned a couple of them historical, so it was a pretty easy transition I felt going into Paul Revere. I don't have another book just now working. I did just put out a proposal, which I'm just getting my head around a little bit. So maybe the next time we talk, I'll be able to say what it is, but I'm just not quite there yet.
Excellent. Well, the book currently is The Ride, Paul Revere, and the Night That Saved America. People can get it anywhere: Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere books are sold. On Pete Rose, I'm going to check it out. But where do you land? Hall of Fame or?
So again, I left it for people to decide, and what so I'll just tell you quickly. And one of the great things I get is that people have come to me even now, many years later, and they say, I must have gone back and forth 5 or 6 times reading the book, but my biggest problem with it was that he was never given a chance to be voted on. So he was banned in 89. He'd retired in 86. In 91, it's coming up to being his time of eligibility. And they made up the rule that says, Faye Vincent, then the commissioner, was on the Hall of Fame board, and they made up a rule which says, if you're on baseball's ineligibility, you're not eligible for the Hall of Fame. And literally, the only person that's ever shut out baseball ever, who shut out of the Hall of Fame, is Pete Rose. So shoeless Joe Jackson, who famously was part of the throwing of the 1919 World Series, he was eligible to be voted in from 1936 when the Hall of Fame opened to 1991. He didn't make it, but he was eligible to be. So
people could have voted on him.
That what?
People could have voted on him.
They could have voted him. And you look at just last thing, you look at like Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, right, guys who, for different reasons, the steroid usage, and they were on the ballot. And you need 75% to get in. They got up into the 50s, into the 60s. They didn't make it, but the people spoke. And we can disagree or agree. You could be one of the 50 who said they should make it or not, but it followed a democratic process of people voting. And Rose never got that chance, and he should have. He might not have gotten in. He might have got, who knows? Yeah. And so that's the one thing, injustice, I think.
Who knows? Can they do it now?
Yeah, so one thing, and there was a lot of just sort of misunderstood response to this. I wrote a piece for the Globe about it.
By the way, as you're about to say that, this just got everybody engaged. They actually have a lot of thoughts on it. They're not so vocal about Paul Revere because they're just learning about it. I have a comment. Pete Rose is absolutely a Hall of Famer. People have opinions on this.
Yeah. So Rob Manfred, after Rose died. So when Manfred came in, Bud Selig had been the commissioner. Giamatti banned when Bart Giamatti banned Rose. somebody asked him at that press conference, and Giamatti hated having to ban Rose. He loved baseball. He loved Pete Rose. The stories of him going out early and watching Pete would be the first one at the ballpark, 10 a.m., hitting balls, and then he'd go out with the groundskeeper to pick up the balls from the outfield. And Giamatti, the last commissioner we've had who loved baseball beyond anything, would be out there early also watching. But he had no choice. Rose, and you can see it in the betting slips immediately, he just brought the wrong guys into the clubhouse. It was just not. Anyway, so he had to ban him, and somebody asked at that press conference, will he be eligible for the Hall of Fame? And he looked out at the sports writers, and that's who votes, and says, well, that'll be up to you. He was not taking that decision on. And so as the subsequent commissioners came, Rose would ask for reinstatement into baseball, because he was manager of the Reds. If he by the way had admitted it early on, said, I'm sorry, I will never do it again, I'll undergo X amount of counseling, he might have had a 6-month ban, a year ban. He could have been managing the Reds the next 30, 40 years. Who knows, right? Mm-hmm. Pete Rose was not going to do that. Yeah. When Manfred came in, Pete Rose again applied for reinstatement. They spoke to a lot of people about it. I actually went in and spoke with the commissioner, so did other people. And he was still betting on baseball. He was still at that time betting on baseball. Wow. There was no chance that Manfred could have let him back in the game. You just can't have a guy who's betting every day on baseball coaching young kids who maybe need the money even more or whatever. There's no way. Yeah. But Manfred said this shouldn't impact his eligibility for any other museum or Hall of Fame or group. And literally the next day, the Cincinnati Reds said, okay, we're putting him in the Hall of Fame, in our team Hall of Fame. And so then after Rose died, and this is the thing that a lot of people misunderstood, Revere, Manfred said, well, he's no longer in baseball as ineligible. He's not a threat to our game. He can't come in the clubhouse and coach people. He can't bring gambling in. So he's not on the list anymore. And so therefore that made him eligible for the Hall of Fame. In the interim, the Hall of Fame at any point could have said, hey, we're going to rescind this rule or we'll evaluate him or whatever. So now he is eligible. It's a little different because it would have to be by some kind of Veterans Committee, and I think it might be next year that his time comes up, or it's coming up in the next year or two, and it could happen. Yeah, my guess is, especially based on the reaction we just got, there's definitely a popular support for it, and probably, honestly, kicking it 30 years into the future, maybe it makes it more likely to happen. Maybe, and I just and I get it, and I get why watching what Rose did, and not only his statistics, but the way he played. I mean, talk about somebody honoring the integrity of the game and giving their all, and he was a model to people. Yeah. The only thing I think that people miss a little bit is saying, "Oh, it didn't really matter to gambling." Again, it did, and it didn't matter to the way it would matter today, right? It really is a threat to the game. If you're watching and you think that people involved have a lot of money on the game, it really is right. We none of us wants to think, whether you're rooting for a team or against a team, you don't want to think that the fix is in any sense, right? And yeah. Rose just simply took it too far. There's never been gambling. Back in the early days, there was lots of gambling on baseball, but since 1919, there had never been a known gambling operation around baseball and sports like there was around Pete Rose. So that, I think if you think he's a Hall of Famer, more power to you. Just know that that's part of it, right? And that's why I really, honestly, it's like some political opinions. I really respect both sides, right? You can see it both ways, the way people might feel. Yeah. A comment from Monty, great dialogue and conversation. And in bringing this forward, so this is to make it relevant to the political audience. We have prediction markets, all these sorts of things starting to happen in the United States, where it's not gambling, they're markets. That's how they get around it. And I think it will have an impact on politics and campaigns. I know of a member of parliament who's a bookie over in Great Britain, and he bet against himself on his first campaign. He lost money because they bet on everything over there. And then on his last campaign, he was taken out when Starmer came in to office. He lost his seat. He actually bet against himself because he knew he was going to lose, and he made money
his loss. But I don't know. In America, I think that there could be some sideways sorts of situations.
Well, I mean, look, I mean, if we really think about it, right, and the people betting on like when somebody will be assassinated or something like that. I mean, it's all fun and games until it's not, right?
Yeah.
Like they're actual people live. So if you're betting on a piece of legislation, whatever that legislation is, and again, wherever you fall politically, and somebody's going to bet on whether X tax relief or X housing act or something is going to pass, and somebody is making that decision based on their own personal. I mean, that's just, to me, that's a real threat to democracy. Right?
Totally.
I believe in freedom to bet. I'm not a prohibitionist against anything, but there have to be some safeguards because just too much at stake, I think.
But incentives always have an impact, no matter where it is across the system. If you add in incentives, which you put money on something, you have an incentive for it to go a certain way. It always is going to have an impact, which I think gets to your point of why it had an impact on the game and had to have if he was putting money on it.
Right.
Which is a real thing. Well, this has been fascinating, Kostya. I really have appreciated the opportunity, and I feel like we got a bonus getting into the Pete Rose conversation. But let's bring the book title back up. Remind people, The Ride, Paul Revere, and the Night That Saved America. This is an important time in our nation's history, and Kostya Kennedy, we really appreciate you being here.
My pleasure. Enjoy being with you. It's a great time of year and wonderful anniversary for the nation. And thanks very much, Dustin.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Take care.
So that was Kostya Kennedy and our conversation on Paul Revere and the Night That Saved America. And we really do appreciate Kostya spending so much time with us and explaining all the ins and outs of what happened in that night leading up to it and why it matters today and what you might be able to take with you going forward. I do recommend you check out the book. You can get it online. You can probably have it right now if you wanted to on Audible or even on an e-reader. I'd recommend it. I actually listened to the book and it was expertly read, so I highly recommend that. And as you're enjoying this weekend, so this is the live stream. If you're listening to his recording, hopefully you enjoyed the long holiday weekend, but take some time over the next few days to reflect on these 250 years and all the sacrifices, all the people. Paul Revere is just one person who stood up and did something, but there have been people throughout this nation's history who have stepped up and have met the moment, and those are people to be remembered, not just today, but in the coming year and going forward. My hope is that people will take a moment to read books like The Ride and others to get a sense of why this moment is important today and why what happened over the last 250 years is so important. So do check out our other series episodes. The David Barton episode on the Declaration itself and the founders. And then additionally, we have one coming out in another week on Johnny Appleseed and the move into the frontier and the heading west and all of that. So, most of our holiday episodes are a little bit about history. One that isn't part of the series, but was really excellent, and I recommend people checking out, is our Memorial Day episode where we talked about real life correspondence from people in the Civil War who served from the front lines and all those who served and gave the ultimate sacrifice. So please do check out our history episodes. We do really enjoy doing those. And of course, if you're someone who's thinking about running for office or you want to get into politics or you are working in the media and you want to understand it better, do like, follow, and subscribe the podcast. That does help us get the word out. We do appreciate everybody. So whether it's Spotify or it's Apple, YouTube, you name it, wherever you enjoy podcasts, please do like, follow, and subscribe, and share these episodes with other folks and encourage them to check them out. I learned a lot today, learned even more than from even just reading the book, and really do appreciate Kostya Kennedy for coming on to talk about that. And of course, if you are interested in polling and you're interested in what the American people think today, and you'd like to ask the American people questions, join our polling club at pollingclub.com. You can sign up as a free member or as a premium member, but either way, you get to be a part of the conversation and help amplify the American people's perspective, and that's a great way to be involved. And I will admit there are people who are in the prediction markets who like our surveys to know where to put their money. So with that, thank you all very much for being here. Do check out our other America 250 series. We do appreciate you choosing to spend time with us here today. This has been another episode of Political Trade Secrets.
Join us next time by subscribing on iTunes and get show notes and sign up for our newsletter at politicaltradesecrets.com.